Thanks for joining us this afternoon. This is We've Got Issues, and I'm Nancy Furness. And we're filming on location in Port Moody at MLA Rick Glumac's office. And we're on the ancestral and unceded homelands of the Coquitlam, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, Squamish, Katzie, Kwantlen, Kakite, and Stalo nations. So today I'm joined by Kathy Wagner, a Tri-Cities author, who has just recently finished a memoir called Here With You, and it's concerned about the struggles of making sense living with addiction within her own family. And the book, I think, compels the reader to go along with Kathy on her relentless fight to save her son Tristan from drug addiction, and then also through recovery and relapse, and ultimately to Tristan's death through an overdose of fentanyl. So thank you so much for joining us here today, Kathy.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, the book was really powerful. It was one that was brutally honest, I think, and it really gave a lot of good insight into something that many of us really don't know much about. So first of all, thank you for writing it and for sharing your story with us. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the book as we move through. Close to the beginning of the book, I think Tristan is about 15 years old, and you talk quite powerfully about the frustration of not being able to access help for him. And you were noticing changes in his behaviors and his activities. I'm just wondering if you can start us off by telling us, what were your concerns? Like, what kind of changes were you noticing that caused you concern about addiction?
Sure. Tristan was a very sensitive child and teenager, very empathetic, very generous, very kind, but he did struggle in ways. He struggled to fit in or to make friends. And he started using drugs when he was 14. At that time, he was using weed, experimenting a bit with alcohol. He realized alcohol didn't agree with him very much, so he mostly stuck to weed and then ecstasy. And I knew what he was doing at that time because he didn't make any bones about it. He wasn't trying to hide it or pretend. So I was certainly concerned, but I had an older daughter who was also recreationally using drugs in a way that was worrisome, but that I had little power over, and I knew that he had that as a model. So it wasn't until he turned 15 that that I became very aware of the severity of the issue. But when the year he turned 15, grade 10, he got kicked out of 3 different schools for drug-related charges. And he ended up in an alternative school, which would have been great for him had he gone, but he didn't. And that's when he discovered cocaine. So that became his drug of choice. And honestly, the moment he discovered cocaine, everything else started unraveling pretty quickly. So he had always been intensely passionate about martial arts and Taekwondo. He had his first black belt when he was 12. And even that became less exciting for him. So he stopped going to school, he stopped doing his Taekwondo, his moods became very erratic. And even through all of that, I have to admit, had a fair amount of denial.
Right, I think that's a natural response.
It's like, it's this phase, he's gonna get through it, like his older sister, whatever, who was starting to come around. And it wasn't until there's one scene in the book where I see him watching TV, where I saw him watch other people using drugs on screen, and I saw the look on his face, and that just made me realize this kid of mine has a whole different reality when it comes to drugs. It was like it struck me as it's like he was watching porn or something. He was so pulled into watching the drug use that I thought, we're in trouble here.
So that was a big warning, and I remember that part. I read the book, and it really was very compelling, and it drew you right into that whole experience. And I do remember that part where you're talking about him sitting forward and all of a sudden just intensely paying attention. Yeah. So there were some signs, and you were concerned, but you also talk about how frustrated you were at not being able to access the help that was needed when he was so clearly struggling. So you were not able to get access to mental health help or to recovery services unless Tristan had either been arrested or overdosed. Or without his consent.
Without his consent.
Without his consent.
Exactly. And as far as I know, that is still true today. And I don't know, he never went through the route of criminal behaviors or overdosing at a young age. So I don't know what parameters they are. I was told, well, there's ways that you can step in as a parent if those things happen.
Right.
And I was like, well, isn't our role to stop those from happening? Not just my role as a mother, but us as a society. And I tried to get him into treatment. No treatment center could take him in. I talked to my family physicians. I went to support groups. I'm a pretty creative problem solver when it comes to it, and there was not a single thing that was offered. And that is still the case with youth. I'm talking to moms all the time who cannot get help for their children because their children don't want it, and they'd rather be on the streets. Fortunately, Tristan didn't have that as part of his story, but many kids do.
Well, Tristan had a very supportive family, one that obviously cared very, very deeply. Do you think that if you had access to services, would that change anything?
I guess we'll never know. I do think that, Tristan connected very strongly with recovery when he got there. Right. And I do believe that at 15, if he had been exposed to that same environment and the same recovery programs and philosophies and communities, I don't know that he would have connected with it quickly. Like, he might have come in and out a few times. Right. But that was all prior to the fentanyl crisis and the toxic drug crisis. So he would have had more time to find his solidity, find his stable ground before the toxic drugs hit. So, and I do believe that Tristan would have kept coming back to recovery. So if he had started that journey 5 years earlier, things could have been very, very different for him.
Well, and I think, like you say, the fentanyl, the toxic drug crisis really changed a lot of things because you don't necessarily have that time anymore.
That's
so
right.
It's critical. So I guess another thing that really stood out was, like you've already said, that Tristan was very dedicated to martial arts, and he was very skilled at martial arts and very disciplined when it came to that, and also as a chef later on. But as far as the martial arts part, I think you tried to use that passion and channel that to kind of focus his life away from drugs. And at one point you made arrangements for him to go to China, and he spent a year, I believe, at a Shaolin Temple in an intensive Kung Fu training, and you accompanied him for 5 or 6 weeks. Can you tell us what that experience was like and what you were trying to achieve by sending him there or going with him?
That was my creative problem solving to the situation where I knew he needed to get away from drugs. He needed a fresh start, and I needed to find, and it needed to be something that he wanted to do. Tristan's dad and I were separated, and we shared custody. He went back and forth. So if he didn't like what I was offering, he would just go to his dad's.
Okay, another challenge.
So I couldn't make him do anything. So I needed to find something that he really wanted to do. And it was a tough struggle. For a period of time, I was not sure which way he was going to go, whether he was just going to go all into drugs or whether he was going to say, yeah, I want this opportunity. And fortunately he did. So just after he turned 16, we went to China. And I stayed there for 5 weeks. And it was, he was trained by a Shaolin monk. At that point, it was not, it was in a small village in the Kunyushan Mountains, and he trained for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. And I did my own meditation and Tai Chi for way more hours than I ever thought possible. And I saw him shine. Like, he just blossomed there. And it wasn't just, it was the fresh air, the exercise, the discipline, the connection to the community. That was the first time that I really saw him feel like supported by community. And he just connected very strongly. And then he did end up, the school, his Shifu, the Kung Fu master, moved and opened up his own school right beside the Shaolin Temple. So that's where they ended up. And that was a fantastic experience. He got a year drug-free for his body and brain to grow without that. In retrospect, he still showed addictive behaviors and addictive thoughts and patterns during that time. That was very much part of who he was. It wasn't, for many people, addiction is not about the drug. It's about a way of thinking, obsessive compulsive thinking. And that was still apparent.
So in what way? In the training or?
Partly. I mean, he always connected passionately with anything he loved. So the training was for sure part of that. But there were things that, he was with a lot of older men. He was by far the youngest. He was 10 years younger than most of the people there. And
can you tell us, how did you convince the Shaolin monks to take Tristan at such a young age? Because it sounds like you just mentioned that most of the students there were much older. So did that take some of your creative problem solving or persuasion?
No, I found one particular teacher, Shaolin monk, who took foreign students. And he changed schools. He opened up his own school partway through.
I remember that they moved.
That's right.
Yes.
But the first school was open for any foreigners. Now, the Shaolin Temple does not take foreigners. So foreigners can actually not study at the Shaolin Temple. But if there's Shaolin monks that leave the temple, they can open up, I guess, their own training.
So that's why he left the temple, to open up his own training?
I don't know exactly the order of how it works. I know his Shifu was at the Shaolin Temple from the time he was a kid to 1920.
Oh, wow.
That's not an uncommon thing over there. It's a kind of a career path, and they can go train and study and then do their own whatever career.
So you're learning about a whole new culture and a whole new way of life there. How can you describe maybe a day in your life there? What did you do during that time?
Yeah, like I said, I was, for the first, while I was there, I was training alongside of him. I just didn't do the hard martial arts, although they felt really hard to me.
Well, it's all relative, right?
So, as a middle-aged, unathletic person, the Tai Chi was pretty hard. But it was, you get up in the morning and breakfast at 6:30, and then you have time to kind of get yourself organized, and you're doing your warm-ups by 8, and then your warm-up runs, then you're doing drills. Then I did a couple of hours of Tai Chi before lunch, and then a couple of hours of meditation afterwards. And it was a brilliant experience, and it was hard. It was hard for me. I talk in the book about how hard it was for me to just train my mind.
Well, and the discipline that it takes day after day to keep doing that.
And I had no choice, because they wouldn't even, I tried to get out of it. It's like I was like a high school kid trying to skip classes. It's like they were not letting me.
They're not going to stand for that.
I was there for, and that was interesting to me too. It's like, why was I resisting? Why was I trying to get out of it? And it was not just the physical discipline, but the mental discipline of having to create space in myself.
Sort of to be present.
Which was something I had never really done before.
Right.
And that, for me, was the foundation of what I later came back to in my own recovery, that sense of being present, accepting what was in front of me, and just letting go. And that, to me, was the kernel of the seed that was planted that I then kind of grew later on.
Well, you talk also about learning about healthy and unhealthy responses to Tristan or to any loved one who's in addiction. And you talk about not only Tristan's recovery and journey in the book, but also about how important it is for you to be on your own recovery journey. Can you tell us what you were recovering from, and what that journey looked like, or what that process was a little bit?
Yeah, I think I had never in my entire life really lived for myself. I was the kind of person who had always lived for somebody else, for my boyfriends, my husbands, my children, and I did not even know really what I would want to do if I chose my own life. I didn't know what that was.
Well, I think sometimes when you've got these other obligations and so many, pressures on at the same time, that it's easy to do. It's easy to always be doing stuff for somebody else, right?
I think it's far easier to find what other people need and try to provide that than to think about what we need for ourselves.
Right.
And that was my go-to, and that's what I had modeled. My mom always was a giver, right? She loved to help people. That's how that's her identity.
Right.
And so I just always thought it was doing for. And I had a series of relationships where that was kind of taken advantage of, really.
Okay.
But
Yes.
I couldn't identify that. It was all mixed up as just the way things are.
Right.
And with Tristan, it was the same thing. He was who he was, and he needed my help, and he needed my attention. So of course that's what I'm going, like, I'm a mama bear, I'm going to save my cub, right?
Right, of course.
But I realized through his recovery that I have my own life, that he is an adult, and he does have supports around him at that time, and there are supports to help him, and there's supports to help me, and it was no longer, it was my responsibility was my life, not anybody else's. And that's fundamentally what it came down to at that time, and what it continues to come down to is me staying in my lane. And
it's really interesting lessons, and when you read the book you get those lessons, right? So it's, can you, was writing the book part of your recovery process?
Well, it certainly was for grief. I began writing the book in earnest about 1.5 years after Tristan passed.
Right.
Before that, I had been, jotting down my thoughts in very incoherent, rambling kind of ways.
Which is can be very therapeutic too,
It absolutely
right?
was. But for me, writing the whole book was my therapy. That was absolutely the cathartic release that I needed, at least on first draft.
Yeah.
And then the subsequent dozens of drafts, that became writing for the audience.
Right, so the
make it
first part
readable
is
and-
very reflective and getting those thoughts out, and then after that it's more technical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It also has to work for readers, but
Right.
it was very much, and it was eye-opening. And right through the entire time, actually, even through some of the editing and revisions, I was continuing to learn more about myself. Every time I would have to think deeply about something. That's how I processed my grief, not just Tristan's death, but my grief that I held through his life in addiction. And learned a lot more about myself. I became much more compassionate to myself by writing and seeing that person on the page rather than just...
Right, which is really interesting, so that you can see yourself as it's written down and become more passionate towards your own self. So that's, a huge step forward that maybe you couldn't have taken if you didn't write the book. So I think the book is really honest, right? Like I don't think you hold anything back from the reader, and it's also sometimes quite graphic in what's happening. But the book isn't really apologetic it doesn't apologize for Tristan's behaviors or his actions as an addict, or about your own actions in trying to support him. So I think the book to me seems to be more about acceptance. And there's a term that you use saying, learning to live life on life's terms. Can you talk about what that means and what it means, and sort of how it applied as you were going through this whole roller coaster experience of, recovery and relapse and worry and exploring and discovering? Like, how did that term
There's a lot
work?
there. I'm just going to first touch on the idea of being unapologetic, because it's fascinating to me that many people have been using that term in reference to my book. And it made me stop and think. I actually wrote something the other day, a post about it. It made me think, like, why are people expecting me to be apologetic?
That's interesting.
And is it because, I'm talking about subjects around substance use, and there's so much stigma and judgment around that I should be apologizing for that? Or is it because I'm a mother and everybody likes to judge mothers? And fundamentally what I wanted to show in this book was that I was a mother who loved and lived and did the very best I could in near impossible situations, and there was no way I could get it right, because it didn't matter what I did or what I didn't do, I couldn't save my son. So in retrospect, I certainly have regrets, but I did the absolute best I could, so I cannot apologize. And the one thing that I wanted to be very clear on when I was writing this book is that if there's anybody else who was where I was, who is reading it, who is struggling with a teen in addiction or has lost a kid to drug harms, I did not want them to feel judged.
Right.
And so I could not judge myself. I could not apologize for anything, because any parent who is trying to raise their kid or is dealing with grief and does it, with the intention of loving and keep getting up every day and trying, they are heroes. There's no judgment at all, and I wanted that to come through. As far as the acceptance, if it's okay, I can read a short piece.
Yes.
And the piece I'm going to read just says it better than I could say. I could talk it out. But it's a piece where I'm coming to terms towards the end of the book about some of the traumas that Tristan faced, and some of the traumas that he perpetuated in his addiction.
Right.
And these are things that no mother wants to hear, no mother wants to know. And I had a very hard time with it. In fact, it was only in one of the very last revisions that I added these pieces in the book, because it was when I was ready to address them.
Right.
And so I'm just going to jump in and kind of read. It's just a couple of minutes of me embracing the wholeness of Tristan.
Okay.
For the first time, I acknowledged how much trauma Tristan had experienced. From our divorce, which had not been easy on anybody, and my 5-year-old boy least of all, through him losing himself in his efforts to fit in and finding comfort in the escape of using drugs. In his short life, Tristan had been bullied, assaulted, and abused, and he had also bullied, assaulted, and abused others. There was so much that I had not or could not protect him from, so much of his pain I hadn't known or understood. I'd be haunted by guilt for the rest of my life, I knew. I closed my eyes and felt the soul-deep pain of knowing I hadn't been able to save Tristan from the nightmares I had feared for him, knowing I had played a part in setting the stage for those nightmares through my own ignorance and dysfunction born of generations of family addiction. Hurt people, the phrase came to me as a whisper in my mind. Yes, I countered, and healed people heal people. In recovery, Tristan had begun to heal and share his healing with others. 3 people had approached me after he died to tell me how he had saved their lives by listening to them, encouraging them, and believing in them, and by sharing his struggles and sobriety with them. His sister, Jen, was one of those people. And who had inspired my own journey of recovery, if not Tristan? To heal, Tristan had needed to acknowledge his challenges, his actions, his trauma, to share them with others and to own them. With work and time, they might have been transformed from shameful secrets that pulled him down into strength that brought him compassion and insight to help others. Like alchemy, his pain and trauma may have been transformed, but they would never have gone away. They had been part of him. By denying Tristan's troubled soul, I realized I'd been denying his experiences, his budding strength, his wholeness. I'd been denying his hard work and healing. I remembered all those years when I had separated my son from his addiction, whether it was his gaunt face and vacant eyes, or disgusting bedroom filled with garbage and worse, or the profanities he hurled at me. I had labeled that his addiction, not him. It was true on some level. I knew without doubt that Tristan's soul, the essence of his being, the part that made him Tristan, could never be marred by addiction. We all have an impenetrable kernel inside us that shines with our brightest potential. But that's our source of divinity, not our humanity. Separating Tristan from his addiction had comforted me, but it was a luxury that he had not been able to afford given the reality of his human existence. Even when his addiction had hijacked his mind and taken control of his life, as I knew it had, Tristan was right there along for the ride, sometimes enthusiastically, sometimes passively, and other times as a resisting hostage fighting for his life. Whichever way, he was there, living those experiences, having those thoughts, taking those actions. He lived with the damage of his addiction every minute of every day, and then put in heroic efforts to stop the damage and wherever possible reverse it. His addiction was him, just as surely as he was so much more than his addiction. Yes, Tristan had been good and loving and kind-hearted, and he'd done bad things. Tristan had been thoughtful and empathetic and generous, and he'd been abusive. It was not one or the other. It was both. Life on life's terms, I thought. I didn't get to pick and choose the terms like I was ordering from a menu. We get what we are given. These thoughts soothed me. I could feel a softening within, a stillness where there had previously been struggle and acceptance. I was no longer defending Tristan or myself. I would always have regrets, as I knew Tristan had. We had both done things we'd been ashamed of, but we'd also both done things we could be proud of. We'd done our best, and I could be okay with that.
Yeah, there's so much packed into the book. Like, honestly, yeah, can we talk a little bit more about what you just said there with Tristan? You know, you talk about how he is so generous and so wanting to help other people, and very sincere about that. And then other times when his behavior is very destructive. You know, when he's going through relapse and things like that. But can you share some thoughts? Like, there were many people who kind of helped Tristan when he was going through those really tough, destructive times. Not only family, but his recovery, that whole recovery community, which I think a lot of people aren't really aware that exists. So when Tristan was going through these times of relapse, which were really tough, can you talk about how support from that recovery community helped him?
Absolutely.
And also about when he helped others in the same situation, just how that whole community works.
Yeah, and to be fair, particularly during his relapses, after he was sober for the first time and entered recovery, the damage he did was always to himself at that point. But yeah, the recovery community, and this was particularly the New Westminster recovery community, which is where he was located. His support networks were there. And even though he had been through a couple different treatment centers in that area, it was not the treatment centers themselves, but it was the people that he had met there, the people that he had met out in the community, specifically the NA, Narcotics Anonymous community, that saved his life repeatedly. So I talk in the book about he had one longer relapse when he was out for about 6 weeks. And he didn't know what to do. Eventually, he was in a position where he had lost his job again. He was going to get kicked out of the drug den where he was staying, essentially. And he didn't know what to do, so he just wandered into an NA meeting on a Friday night.
So he did this himself?
He just walked into a meeting because that's all he knew how to do.
Right.
But he had at least enough experience at that point to know that there was help there waiting for him. And so he had a number of friends and people that he had never met before that just gathered around him and said, "Hey, are you ready to come back?" And he said, "Yeah." And he was loaded at the time. He was not sober at the time, but he knew he needed to be. So they wouldn't let him go home. They gave him a place to sleep, a good meal. They rallied the troops the next day for brunch, and a bunch of them got together for brunch and had, organized a plan, got him a sponsor, figured out
So they were taking care of that themselves, having been there and knowing what to do and how to best support him.
Yeah, because there's and they do, they totally go out. Even when the last couple nights of Tristan's life, there were people in that community who were driving around searching for him, trying to bring him home, right? And when I say home, like home to them, home to their community, home
somewhere safe.
So home to somewhere safe.
Yes.
And he knew that he was still pretending to be sober, and he ended up going to a friend that is not part of the New Westminster recovery community, somebody that he knew in his drug using days, but who was now in recovery, a softer recovery. They used weed, but no hard drugs. So he was there on that evening, and I've heard from her a couple of times, and it so heartens me that on the last night of his life, he was with a friend, helping neighbors, bringing their groceries, saying hi.
So that generous spirit.
Laughing his heart out with, sharing thoughts about life and where he was going to go, and, with friends, and still ultimately that couldn't save him.
So there's this hope, always, right? You talk about being very angry after Tristan's death. You're angry, of course, because he died, but you were also angry because other people's children continued to die, sort of relentlessly, day after day after day. We're seeing this. We're still seeing this, the toxic drug situation, and you felt like nobody really cared at the time. So you became involved in some advocacy work. Mums Stop the Harm is one group that you became involved with. Can you tell us about how you're continuing on through advocacy and maybe some of the other things that you're involved in?
Yes, thank goodness for Mums Stop the Harm. They were there. I knew about them even before Tristan passed. I was kind of following them, passively on social media. And after Tristan passed, I joined. And there's kind of two branches to Mums Stop the Harm. There is the advocacy branch, and there is a grief support. Kind of branch. So after Tristan first passed, I certainly attended all of the rallies and did all of the things, but my greatest support from that group was from grief. It's hard to share that kind of grief with people who don't understand. Yes. And for me to be able to see these powerful women who had lost their children and who were still alive,
still living
and occasionally
their lives,
laughing and had other things, like that was such a beacon of light for me.
Right.
And one of the things I remember saying to them early on is like, oh, I feel badly because I cannot do all the things that you can do. And they're like, you don't have to. You don't ever have to. You do what you can do. And you've just lost your son.
So there's no judgment, no pressure there to...
And that really freed me up. And so ultimately what I have found, what works for me is I don't have the same kind of physical energy or constant anger that I think I would need to drive myself towards very active advocacy. Right. Where I advocate is through my writing. So for, not just in the book, but in various articles that I write for various places, I write around topics that I hope will raise awareness of the drug toxicity crisis, the addiction and mental health crisis, the desperate need for better recovery and addiction support services, and helping other parents through their grief to know that there is hope, that there's always hope. Even if it looks very different than they ever expected it to.
Well, and I think if you think back, if you had this book to read or, these articles to read, how much it would help, right? Yeah. So knowing that you're helping others go through a very difficult situation as well must make you feel, gratified somewhat. I think you've named some things that we could improve on, like access to recovery and advocacy and support groups and things like that. So I really thank you for coming today and sharing a difficult story and a very human story and making it accessible to people that really may not understand. It gives us a better understanding, I think, of the whole process and what you experienced. So thanks so much for joining us and sharing your story today, Kathy. And thanks for joining us on We've Got Issues. We're filming on location at MLA Rick Glumac's office in Port Moody, and we are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of Coast Salish nations. Thank you.